And frankly, I've been really disturbed about the fallout from the jury's announcement yesterday that the killer of one Jordan Neely, another young person, white man by the name of Daniel Penny, was going to go free. This was really eerie because at the beginning of the show yesterday, we were talking about vigilantes and vigilante violence. And we were talking about the way in which white American culture has been in many ways centered around the idea of vigilante justice, particularly when it comes to controlling Black bodies. Now, yesterday we talked about the Vicksburg massacre. And if you missed that conversation, I encourage you to go get on the app, go back to it and just take a listen because we talked about it in depth. But that was an example of an older era reality that I saw being reflected in the modern era because we had in recent news, not in the 1800s, as which was when the Vicksburg massacre took place, but in recent news, we found out that in the state of Missouri, and in other jurisdictions as well, they have been introducing legislation that would essentially allow for militias to receive compensation for the undocumented immigrants that they are able to apprehend. And we talked a little bit yesterday about how that effort is very similar to the fugitive slave law reality, wherein every white American was essentially deputized to turn Black people in if those Black people had been suspected of being formerly enslaved and having freed themselves. If you committed the crime of being a Black person and being free, and you took your freedom for yourself from the white person who owned you, that was criminal activity. And as a result of the fugitive slave laws, every white person in America was essentially deputized to turn you in. Now, you may be wondering, well, how would they know who to turn in? Like, I mean, there were free Blacks as well. There were some Black people who were freed who had never been enslaved. And you would be correct. However, it didn't matter. Like there was a whole movie about it, 12 Years a Slave. That man had not been enslaved. He was a part of the Black upper crust, if you will, the Black middle class, if you will. And yet his Black middle class upper crusty behind, actually, I don't think he was middle class. I think in the 12 Years a Slave, I think they showed him more as upper class Black, free Black. But they basically took his upper class Black self and sold him down the river. And which meant he was enslaved 12 years. There was a whole film based on the book. And so in that reality, what we saw was that it didn't matter if you were a Black person who had been formerly enslaved, who was being accused of that crime of freeing yourself. It could be anybody Black. And you just had to be able to prove that you were free. Now, how do you as a free Black prove that you've never been enslaved? How do you as a free Black in the 1800s prove that you, or in any era in which slavery was permissible, how do you as a free Black person prove that these white people who have accused you of freeing yourself wrongfully from the trappings of enslavement, how are you supposed to be able to prove that you're free and that what you're saying is true and that what they're saying is a lie? And think about it, this is really important because in this era, Black people could not testify against white people. So you would have had to have found other white people who would vouch for you, who would testify on your behalf saying, no, he truly or she truly was never enslaved. They do not deserve to be sent back up the river, or they do not deserve to be sent into enslavement because they are not a fugitive slave. They're a free Black person. And if that white person, if you were able to find that white person to say that you were not a formerly enslaved person who had freed yourself by your own hand, thereby committing a crime of breathing and being in a Black body while free, if you could find a white person to vouch for you, what evidence would they be able to put up against other white people who are saying, oh, absolutely, the F not. They most certainly are a formerly enslaved person who is wrongfully free because they are rightfully owned by Mr. White Man who lives down south. Think about that. It's all a legal fiction. It's all legalities, if you will, of one sort or another. It's all creations of the European legal structure's mind. And so that's the reality that we were talking about yesterday. We were talking about what that looked like in the early 1800s when vigilantes were able to basically be a deputized group that said any white person with a weapon could find any Black person anywhere and essentially credibly accuse them of being a formerly enslaved Black person and thereby collect a bounty. Well, it would be one thing if that sort of story only stayed in the history books, but the reality is we then learned about, as I mentioned, the folks in Missouri who were introducing that legislation that would say that militias who are organized to help out help support the border patrol effort and the mass deportation effort will now have a financial incentive to do so. And so we talked about that at the beginning of the show. Right, that was at the very beginning. That was one of the first things we mentioned, one of the first stories we covered after the moment of gratitude. And then it was very surreal at the end of the show to hear that the jury in the case of Jordan Neely had essentially, I'm sorry, the jury in the case of Daniel Penny had essentially said that that white man had not committed a crime when he took Jordan Neely's life.